The rain hammered against my workshop windows like bullets, each drop echoing through the converted garage where I'd been tinkering with a broken wheelchair ramp. It was past midnight in Pine Ridge, Colorado, and I should have been asleep hours ago. Instead, I found myself staring at the half-finished project, thinking about another sleepless night ahead. That's when I heard the car doors slam outside. I wasn't expecting anyone. Hell, nobody came up this mountain road after dark, especially not in weather like this. The headlights cut through the rain like searchlights, illuminating the gravel driveway I'd laid myself 3 years ago when Sofia and I first moved here. I wiped my hands on an old rag and stepped toward the window, squinting through the downpour. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man in an expensive suit was struggling to get someone out of the passenger seat, his movements frantic and desperate. The someone was a young man, maybe 16 or 17, completely limp in a wheelchair that looked like it cost more than my truck. The kid's head hung forward, lifeless, while his father wrestled with an umbrella that the Colorado wind kept turning inside out. I didn't think, I just moved. Within seconds, I was outside in the storm, my workshop apron already soaked through. The older man looked up at me with eyes that held the kind of desperation I recognized all too well. The same look I'd seen in my own mirror 3 years ago. "Please," he shouted over the thunder, rain streaming down his face. "You're Mateo Rivera, right? The physical therapist? I've been looking for you everywhere." I froze. Nobody had called me that in years. Not since I'd walked away from everything, packed up Sofia, and disappeared into these mountains to escape the memories that still haunted my dreams. The man must have seen something in my expression because he pressed on, his voice breaking. "My son Lucas, he won't even try anymore. The doctors, the specialists, they've all given up. But I heard about you, about what you used to do before." He gestured helplessly at the boy in the wheelchair, who hadn't moved or acknowledged our presence. "I know you retired, but please, he's all I have left." The kid finally lifted his head, and what I saw there hit me like a physical blow. Those weren't the eyes of a teenager. They were the eyes of someone who'd already given up on life, someone who'd decided that existing was easier than living. I'd seen those same eyes staring back at me from every mirror in every hospital I'd worked in, before everything fell apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing there in the rain, looking at this broken family on my doorstep, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. Maybe it was the way the father's hand shook as he gripped the wheelchair handles. Or maybe it was the way the storm seemed to pause just long enough for me to really see them both. This wasn't just about money or desperation. This was about a father watching his son disappear right in front of him, powerless to stop it. I thought about Sofia, asleep in her bed upstairs, and how she'd been asking me lately why I seemed so sad all the time. I thought about the workshop full of half-finished projects, all the ways I'd been trying to stay busy while avoiding the one thing I'd been born to do. And I thought about the promise I'd made to myself never to get involved in someone else's pain again. But looking at Lucas, seeing the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to disappear into himself, I knew I was already involved whether I wanted to be or not. Some things you can't walk away from, even when walking away is the only thing that's kept you sane for the past 3 years. The father was still talking. Something about driving up from Denver, about hearing my name from someone who knew someone, about being willing to pay anything. But I wasn't listening to the words anymore. I was listening to the silence between them, the space where a father and son should have been talking to each other but weren't. That silence told me everything I needed to know about what was really broken here. "Get him inside," I finally said, stepping back toward my workshop door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Both of you will figure out the rest once you're dry. The inside of my workshop smelled like sawdust and motor oil, a combination that had become as familiar to me as breathing over the past 3 years. I watched as David Thornton, as he'd introduced himself, carefully maneuvered Lucas's wheelchair through the doorway, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against my concrete floor. The contrast was almost comical if it weren't so heartbreaking. Here was a man who probably commanded boardrooms full of executives, reduced to fumbling with a wheelchair in a converted garage in the middle of nowhere. Lucas hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived. His dark hair hung in his face, dripping rainwater onto a hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Everything about his posture screamed defeat, from the way his hands lay motionless in his lap, to the way he stared at a fixed point on my workbench like he was trying to will himself invisible. I grabbed a couple of towels from my supply cabinet and handed one to David, keeping the other for Lucas. When I approached the wheelchair, the kid flinched away from me so violently that I actually took a step back. It was the first real reaction I'd gotten from him, and it told me more about his mental state than any medical file could have. "Easy," I said quietly, the same tone I used to use with my most traumatized patients back in Denver. "I'm not going to hurt you." David was toweling off his graying hair, his movements sharp and agitated. "Lucas has been like this for 8 months, he said, as if his son wasn't sitting right there listening to every word. "Ever since the accident. The doctors say physically he should be able to make some progress, but he refuses to even try the exercises." I kept my eyes on Lucas as his father spoke, watching for any flicker of emotion. There it was, a slight tightening around his eyes when David mentioned the exercises. Not defiance exactly, but something deeper. Fear maybe, or exhaustion so profound that even the thought of trying felt impossible. "What kind of accident?" I asked, directing the question to Lucas even though I suspected his father would answer. Sure enough, David launched into what sounded like a rehearsed explanation. "Car accident last winter. Lucas was driving home from football practice when he hit a patch of ice. The car rolled 3 times before hitting a tree. Spinal cord injury at L2, incomplete but severe. He was unconscious for 6 days. I nodded, filing away the medical details while continuing to watch Lucas. Incomplete injuries were often the cruelest kind, because they left room for hope that might never be fulfilled. The uncertainty could drive someone crazy, especially a kid who'd probably never faced a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer determination and athletic ability. "Lucas," I said, crouching down so we were at eye level, "your dad says you used to play football. What position?" For a moment, I didn't think he was going to answer. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, "Quarterback. Of course. The leader, the one everyone looked to when the game was on the line." No wonder sitting helpless in a wheelchair felt like a death sentence to him. I understood now why the traditional rehabilitation approach hadn't worked. You can't treat someone who'd built their entire identity around physical dominance and control the same way you'd treat someone who'd never defined themselves that way. "State championship 2 years running," David added proudly, then caught himself as Lucas's jaw tightened. I mean, he was being recruited by Colorado State, maybe even getting looked at by some bigger schools. The past tense hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Lucas closed his eyes, and I could practically see him disappearing further into himself. This wasn't just about walking again. This was about a future that had been ripped away, dreams that had died in a twisted pile of metal on an icy road. I stood up and walked over to my workbench, pretending to organize some tools while I processed what I'd observed. 8 months of refusing therapy meant 8 months of muscle atrophy, joint stiffness, and psychological barriers building higher every day. Most therapists would focus on the physical rehabilitation first, trying to force movement through repetitive exercises and motivation techniques. But I'd learned the hard way that the mind had to heal before the body could follow. "Mr. Thornton," I said, turning back to face them, "can I ask why you drove all the way up here instead of staying with the specialist in Denver?" "They've got equipment I don't have, resources I can't match." David's composure cracked for just a moment, and I saw the raw desperation underneath his polished exterior. "Because they've given up on him." Oh, they don't say it directly, but I can see it in their eyes. They go through the motions, bill the insurance company, and send us home with homework that Lucas won't do. They treat him like a lost cause. "And you think I won't?" "I think you're the only person left who might actually see him as a person instead of a medical condition." The words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. 3 years ago, I'd walked away from physical therapy because I'd started seeing my patients the same way, as conditions to be managed rather than people to be healed. It had taken losing everything that mattered to me to remember why I'd gotten into this work in the first place. Sofia's footsteps on the stairs inside the house reminded me that I wasn't just making a decision for myself anymore. My 8-year-old daughter had been through enough upheaval in her short life. The last thing she needed was her father dragging more broken people into their carefully constructed sanctuary. But as I looked at Lucas, really looked at him, I saw something that made my chest tighten. Underneath all that defeat and resignation, there was still a spark. It was buried deep, almost extinguished. But it was there. The same spark I'd seen in Sofia's eyes when she'd asked me why I didn't help people anymore. Why I'd stopped doing the thing that used to make me smile. "I'm not a miracle worker," I said finally. "And I'm not going to lie to you about what's possible. But if you're willing to do this my way, with no guarantees and no shortcuts, then maybe we can figure something out." David leaned forward eagerly. "Anything. Whatever it costs, whatever you need." I shook my head. "This isn't about money, Mr. Thornton. It's about trust. Lucas has to want this, not just you. And right now I don't think he wants anything except to be left alone." For the first time since they'd arrived, Lucas looked directly at me. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, dark and turbulent, but there was something there that hadn't been before. Not hope exactly, but curiosity maybe. Like he was wondering what made me different from all the other people who'd promised to help him. "What's your way?" he asked, his voice stronger than before. I pulled up a stool and sat down, making sure we were still at the same level. "First, we stop talking about you like you're not here. Second, we forget everything the doctors have told you about what you can and can't do. Third, we start with something small, something that has nothing to do with walking." David looked confused. "But isn't the goal to get him mobile again?" "The goal," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Lucas, "is to help him remember that he's more than his legs. Everything else comes after that." Lucas studied my face for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. He was smart, this kid. Smart enough to recognize that I wasn't selling him false hope or pushing him toward some predetermined finish line. I was offering him something much more dangerous and much more valuable, the chance to rediscover who he was underneath all the pain and disappointment. "When do we start?" he asked. The question caught both his father and me off guard. It was the first time Lucas had shown any initiative in months, according to David's earlier complaints. But I could see the fragile nature of this moment, how easily it could shatter if I pushed too hard or moved too fast. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "If you're still here and still willing." David immediately started making arrangements, talking about extending their stay at the lodge in town, adjusting his work schedule, hiring local help. But I was watching Lucas, noting the way his shoulders had straightened slightly, the way he'd unconsciously gripped the arms of his wheelchair like he was preparing for something. Maybe this crazy plan could actually work. Maybe I could help this kid find his way back to himself without losing my own carefully rebuilt peace of mind in the process. Or maybe I was about to make the same mistakes that had destroyed my career and my marriage 3 years ago, dragging Sofia into the wreckage with me this time. But looking at Lucas, seeing that tiny spark of interest flickering in his eyes for the first time in months, I knew I had to try. Some risks were worth taking, even when you couldn't see where they'd lead. The next morning arrived gray and cold, typical for October in the Colorado mountains. I'd been awake since 5, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and staring out at the pine trees that surrounded our property. Sleep had been elusive, my mind churning through treatment plans and worst-case scenarios in equal measure. Sofia had found me in the kitchen at 6:30, her dark curls still messy from sleep, clutching the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3. "Are the sad people coming back today?" she asked, climbing onto the stool next to mine at the kitchen island. I'd learned not to underestimate my daughter's perception. At 8 years old, she could read emotions better than most adults I knew. "They're not sad people, sweetheart. They're people who are going through a hard time. Like we did when Mama died?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest, the way it always did when Sofia made these matter-of-fact observations about our past. "Yeah, something like that." She nodded thoughtfully, spooning cereal into her mouth. The boy in the chair looked really angry. But not angry at us. Angry at everything. That was exactly right. And the fact that Sofia had picked up on it so quickly reminded me why I'd been so good at my job before everything fell apart. Understanding the emotional component was always half the battle, sometimes more than half. Lucas wasn't just dealing with a physical injury. He was drowning in rage and helplessness, and every well-meaning attempt to motivate him had probably pushed him deeper underwater. David's rental car pulled into my driveway at exactly 9 o'clock. I watched through the window as he got out and went around to help Lucas, who immediately waved him away with obvious irritation. Good. Independence, even in small gestures, was something I could work with. I met them at the workshop door, noting that Lucas looked slightly more alert today. His hair was cleaner, pushed back from his face, and he was wearing a different hoodie. Still defeated, but maybe fighting the defeat a little bit. "Morning," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "How was the lodge?" "Adequate," David replied, which probably meant it was the nicest place he'd stayed in months, but didn't meet his usual standards. Lucas slept better than he has in weeks, actually. I looked at Lucas for confirmation, but he just shrugged. Fair enough. Trust would take time. My workshop looked different in the morning light streaming through the windows. Less cluttered somehow, more purposeful. I'd spent an hour after they'd left the night before, moving things around, creating space for what I had in mind. The changes were subtle, but Lucas's eyes swept the room like he was cataloging every detail. "So what's the plan?" David asked, settling into the chair I'd pulled out for him. "Should Lucas change into workout clothes? Do you have equipment he needs to use?" I held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Thornton, I need to be clear about something from the start. This is between Lucas and me. You're welcome to stay and observe, but you can't participate, you can't coach from the sidelines, and you definitely can't negotiate on his behalf." David's face flushed slightly. "I'm just trying to help." "I know you are, but part of what we're working on here is Lucas making his own decisions, speaking for himself, and taking ownership of his progress or lack thereof. Every time you jump in to answer for him or push him harder, you're reinforcing the message that he's not capable of handling his own life." The silence that followed was thick with tension. I could see David struggling with the concept of stepping back, probably the same way he'd struggled with every aspect of Lucas's injury that couldn't be solved with money or influence. Lucas cleared his throat. "He does that a lot. Talks for me like I'm not here." It was the longest sentence I'd heard him speak, and the fact that he directed it at me, rather than his father, was significant. David looked like he'd been slapped, but to his credit, he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been doing that." "I'm sorry, Lucas." The apology seemed to surprise Lucas as much as it did me. These two had a lot more work to do on their relationship, but at least David was willing to acknowledge his mistakes. That was more than I could say for most of the parents I'd worked with over the years. I pulled my stool over to where Lucas sat and gestured toward my workbench. "See that wooden box over there? The one with the brass hinges?" Lucas followed my gaze to a small jewelry box I'd been working on as a Christmas present for Sofia. The lid was partially assembled, the joints visible but not yet glued. "I see it. I need someone with steady hands and good fine motor control to help me finish that. The pieces have to fit together perfectly, and if the measurements are off by even a fraction, the whole thing won't work. Think you might be interested in giving it a try?" I watched confusion flicker across both Lucas's and David's faces. This clearly wasn't what they'd expected from a physical therapy session. No parallel bars, no exercise mats, no motivational speeches about taking first steps. "I thought we were going to work on my legs," Lucas said. "We are. Just not the way you think." I rolled the stool closer to the workbench. "Lucas, what made you good at quarterback?" He considered the question. "Reading the defense, I guess. Knowing where everyone was supposed to be and adapting when they weren't." "What else?" "Hand-eye coordination. Accuracy. Being able to put the ball exactly where my receiver could catch it, even under pressure." I nodded. "All of that requires incredible precision and control, right?" "Split-second timing, muscle memory, the ability to make micro-adjustments on the fly." "Yeah, so?" "So those skills don't just disappear because your legs don't work the same way. Your hands, your eyes, your brain, they're all still there, still capable of precision and control and adaptation." I gestured toward the jewelry box. "This project requires all of those things. And if you can do this, if you can prove to yourself that you still have those abilities, then maybe we can start talking about what else might be possible." Lucas stared at the box for a long moment. I could see him processing the idea, weighing it against months of medical professionals focusing exclusively on his lower body, treating his upper body like it was somehow damaged by association. What if I mess it up? Then we start over. That's what woodworking teaches you. Patience, persistence, and the willingness to begin again when something doesn't work out the way you planned. David shifted in his chair, clearly wanting to say something but holding back. Good. This moment belonged to Lucas. Okay, Lucas said finally. I'll try. I spent the next 2 hours teaching Lucas the basics of precision woodworking. How to measure twice and cut once. How to test fit joints before committing to glue. How to sand with the grain instead of against it. How to read the wood's natural patterns and work with them instead of fighting them. His hands were steadier than I'd expected, muscle memory from years of throwing perfect spirals translating surprisingly well to guiding a chisel along a marked line. When he made a mistake, which happened several times, he didn't throw the piece across the room or give up in frustration. He studied the error, figured out what had gone wrong, and tried again. David watched in fascination as his son became absorbed in the work, the defeated posture gradually giving way to focused concentration. This was probably the most engaged he'd seen Lucas since before the accident. "This is harder than it looks," Lucas said, trying to fit 2 pieces together that weren't quite matching up. "Most worthwhile things are," I replied. "The question is, do you want to keep trying, or do you want to quit?" He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of the competitor he used to be. "I don't quit." By the end of the session, Lucas had successfully assembled one corner of the jewelry box. It wasn't perfect. There was a small gap that would need to be filled with wood putty, and one of the joints was slightly crooked. But it was solid, functional, and entirely his own work. "Not bad for a first attempt," I said, examining his handiwork. "Tomorrow we'll work on the opposite corner. By the end of the week, you might have a complete box." "Tomorrow?" David interjected. "I thought we'd be doing this daily, maybe even twice daily. We're paying for intensive therapy." I turned to face him, keeping my voice level. "Mr. Thornton, healing isn't something you can accelerate by throwing money at it or demanding more intensive scheduling. Lucas's body needs time to process what we're doing here, and his mind needs time to adjust to the idea that he's still capable of learning and growing." Lucas was running his fingers along the joint he'd created, testing its strength. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to come back tomorrow, if that's okay." The quiet pride in his voice told me everything I needed to know about whether my unconventional approach was working. For the first time in 8 months, Lucas had accomplished something difficult, something that required skill and patience and perseverance. More importantly, he'd done it without anyone having to motivate or cajole or bribe him into trying. As they prepared to leave, Sofia appeared in the workshop doorway, still in her school clothes, from the homeschool session we'd finished an hour earlier. She studied the jewelry box corner with the serious expression she got when examining her own art projects. "That's really good," she told Lucas. "Did you make it for someone special?" Lucas glanced at me, then back at Sofia. "I don't know yet. Maybe." Sofia nodded as if this made perfect sense. I always know who my art is for when I'm finished making it. Sometimes, it surprises me. After they left, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the familiar smell of wood shavings and machine oil, thinking about what had just happened. Lucas had spent 2 hours focused on something other than his limitations, something that challenged him without overwhelming him. He'd experienced success without anyone having to lower the bar or make excuses for him. It was a start, a small one, but a start nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and eventually we'd have to address the elephant in the room, the question of whether Lucas would ever walk again, and what his life might look like if he didn't. But for now, it was enough that he'd remembered what it felt like to be good at something, to create rather than just endure. The real test would come when the novelty wore off, when the work got harder, when Lucas had to confront the deeper questions about who he was beyond his physical abilities. But watching him today, seeing that spark of determination flicker back to life, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, we were on the right track. 3 weeks had passed since Lucas first touched that jewelry box, and something fundamental had shifted in my workshop. What started as a simple woodworking project had evolved into something I hadn't anticipated. Lucas arrived every morning at 9 sharp, no longer needing his father to help him from the car. He'd figured out how to transfer himself more efficiently, and more importantly, he'd started making decisions about his own schedule and needs. The jewelry box was nearly complete now, Its corners fitted perfectly, and its surface smooth as glass from hours of careful sanding. But more significant than the craftsmanship was what I'd observed in Lucas during those 3 weeks. The defeated teenager who'd arrived in my workshop had been replaced by someone who asked questions, made suggestions, and occasionally even laughed at Sofia's silly jokes when she visited during lunch breaks. David had been surprisingly good about stepping back, though I could see it required constant effort on his part. He'd taken to bringing work with him, setting up a makeshift office in the corner of my workshop where he could keep an eye on Lucas without interfering. The change in their dynamic was subtle but noticeable. Instead of David speaking for Lucas, I now heard them having actual conversations during breaks, tentative but genuine. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when I made a mistake that would either destroy all our progress or push us toward a breakthrough I'd been avoiding. I was demonstrating how to apply a final coat of finish to Lucas's jewelry box when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my ex-wife Maria's number, something I hadn't seen in over a year. My hands went cold, and I nearly dropped the brush I was holding. "Mateo?" Lucas's voice seemed to come from far away. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I set down the brush carefully, my mind racing through possibilities. Maria never called unless something was seriously wrong. The last time we'd spoken was at the divorce proceedings, when she'd made it clear that my obsession with helping broken people had destroyed our marriage, and that she wanted nothing more to do with my self-destructive tendencies. "I need to take this," I said, stepping toward the workshop door. "Keep working on that corner joint. I'll be right back." But as I moved away from the workbench, my leg caught the edge of Lucas's wheelchair, sending me stumbling sideways into a stack of lumber. The impact knocked over a can of stain, sending dark liquid spreading across my concrete floor and soaking into several pieces of expensive walnut I'd been saving for a special project. "Damn it," I muttered, dropping to my knees to try to salvage what I could. The phone continued ringing, Maria's ringtone cutting through my workshop like an accusation. "Answer your phone," Lucas said quietly. "I'll clean this up." "You can't get down here," I snapped, the words coming out harsher than I'd intended. "Your chair can't navigate around this mess." The silence that followed my outburst was deafening. Lucas's face went carefully blank, the same expression he'd worn that first night when he'd retreated into himself. David looked up from his laptop, alarm spreading across his features as he recognized the shift in the room's atmosphere. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. My hands were covered in walnut stain, the floor was a disaster, and I just reminded Lucas of his limitations in the cruelest way possible. Everything I'd worked to build over the past 3 weeks crumbled in the space of 10 seconds. "I'm sorry," I said, standing up slowly. "I didn't mean that. I'm just—" "Yeah, I know what you meant," Lucas interrupted, his voice flat. "I can't get down there because I'm useless. Because I can't do the things normal people can do. Because I'm stuck in this chair and always will be." David started to stand up, but I held up my stained hand to stop him. This was between Lucas and me, and any interference from his father would make things worse. "That's not what I said." "It's what you meant though, isn't it?" Lucas's eyes blazed with a fury I hadn't seen from him before. "All this woodworking stuff, all this talk about precision and skill, it's just busy work to keep the crippled kid occupied while the real world happens around him. You can't even trust me to help clean up a mess." The phone rang again, and this time Lucas reached over and grabbed it from the workbench. "Answer it," he said, thrusting it toward me. "Whatever crisis you're avoiding is obviously more important than pretending I matter." I stared at the phone in his outstretched hand, seeing Maria's name on the display, and suddenly understood what was really happening here. Lucas wasn't just angry about my thoughtless comment. He was angry about being treated like he was fragile, like he needed to be protected from life's complications and difficulties. He was angry about being managed instead of included. "It's my ex-wife," I said, taking the phone but not answering it. "We've been divorced for 2 years. She only calls when something's wrong. Usually something that's my fault." Lucas studied my face, his anger shifting to curiosity. "So answer it and find out what's wrong. Because then I'll have to deal with whatever crisis she's calling about, and I'll probably mess that up too, just like I mess up everything else I try to fix." The admission hung in the air between us. David had gone completely still in his corner, probably recognizing that he was witnessing something more personal than he'd bargained for. Lucas let the wheelchair roll closer to where I stood, navigating around the spilled stain with careful precision. "You know what I figured out about you these past few weeks?" I shook my head, dreading whatever insight he'd gained. "You're scared of the same thing I am, failing at something that matters. So instead of risking it, you hide up here in the mountains fixing other people's problems because it's easier than facing your own." The accuracy of his observation hit me like a physical blow. This 16-year-old kid had seen through all my professional competence and emotional walls straight to the core of what had driven me away from my real life. The phone had stopped ringing, but I knew Maria would call back. She always did when something was urgent. Part of me wanted to turn the phone off, to avoid whatever complication she was bringing into my carefully controlled world. But Lucas was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of challenge and understanding that reminded me why I'd gotten into this work in the first place. "You're right," I said finally. "I am scared. Terrified, actually." "Of what?" I looked around my workshop, at the projects I'd started and abandoned, at the equipment I'd bought but barely used, at all the ways I'd been keeping myself busy without actually living, of caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy me again. Lucas nodded slowly, as if this confession made perfect sense to him. "Is that why you won't work on my legs? Because if you try to help me walk and it doesn't work, you'll have failed at the thing that matters most?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. All the woodworking, all the focus on upper body strength and fine motor skills, all the careful avoidance of the real reason Lucas was here. I'd been so afraid of failing him the way I'd failed my last patient, the way I'd failed Maria, the way I'd failed everyone who'd ever counted on me to make things better. "Yeah," I whispered. "That's exactly why." David had tears in his eyes, probably recognizing his own fears reflected in my admission. How many specialists had he dragged Lucas to? How many experimental treatments had he funded? How many promises had been made and broken? No wonder Lucas had given up hope. No wonder he'd stopped trying. The phone rang again, and this time I answered it without hesitation. "Hello, Maria." "Matteo, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours." Her voice was strained, frightened in a way I'd never heard before. "It's about my brother Carlos. He was in a motorcycle accident last night. Spinal cord injury. The doctors are saying he might never walk again, and he's asking for you. He remembers how good you were before everything fell apart, and he thinks maybe you could help him." I closed my eyes, feeling the universe's sense of irony crashing down on me. Carlos, Maria's younger brother who'd always looked up to me, who'd been planning to follow in my footsteps as a physical therapist before I'd spectacularly destroyed my career and my marriage, in one catastrophic malpractice case. Where is he? Presbyterian St. Joseph in Denver. "Matteo, I know we ended badly. I know I said things I probably shouldn't have, but he's only 23. He's got his whole life ahead of him, and right now he won't even talk to the doctors here. He just keeps asking for you." I looked at Lucas, who had been listening to every word of the conversation. His face had gone pale, probably recognizing the parallels between his situation and Carlos's. A young man, athletic and strong, suddenly facing the possibility that everything he'd planned for his future might be impossible. "I'll be there in 3 hours, I said. After I hung up, Lucas and I stared at each other across the workshop, both of us understanding that everything had just changed. The safe, controlled environment we'd built over the past 3 weeks had been shattered by reality, and now we both had to decide whether we were brave enough to face the things we'd been hiding from. "I want to come with you," Lucas said quietly. "Lucas, I don't think that's a good idea. This is going to be complicated, emotional, probably messy in ways you're not prepared for." "Stop protecting me," he said firmly. "Stop deciding what I can and can't handle. If you're finally ready to stop hiding from the real work, then I want to be there. Maybe I can help." David stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. "If Lucas wants to go, then we go. All of us. Together." Looking at them both, seeing the determination in Lucas's eyes and the quiet support in David's face, I realized that my days of working alone, of avoiding meaningful connections, of playing it safe, were over. Whether I was ready or not, it was time to find out if I still had what it took to help people heal from the kind of devastation that changes everything. The drive to Denver would give us 3 hours to figure out how to face whatever we found there. 3 hours to transform from a reclusive handyman, a desperate father, and a defeated teenager into something that might actually be strong enough to help Carlos find his way back to hope. It was the scariest thing I'd contemplated in 3 years, and the most necessary. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what used to be just my workshop, watching Lucas demonstrate proper wheelchair transfer techniques to Carlos and 3 other patients who'd found their way to what we now called the Pine Ridge Recovery Center. The converted garage had grown into something I never could have imagined that stormy night when David first knocked on my door. Carlos sat in his wheelchair, his dark eyes focused intently on Lucas's instructions. My former brother-in-law had made remarkable progress since that terrifying day in the Denver hospital. But more importantly, he'd found purpose in helping other newly injured patients navigate the early stages of their recovery. The mentorship between him and Lucas had become the foundation of our program. "The key is momentum, not strength," Lucas was saying, his voice confident and clear. "You're not fighting gravity, you're working with it. Watch." I still got chills watching Lucas move. Not because he was walking. That breakthrough had come 4 months ago, tentative steps that had grown stronger with each passing week. What moved me was the transformation in his entire presence. The defeated teenager had become a young man who understood that healing meant more than just physical recovery. David appeared beside me, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile I'd never seen on him during those first desperate weeks. "Hard to believe it's been half a year." "Hard to believe you're still here," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Don't you have a company to run?" "I do. From right here, 3 days a week. Turns out most CEO work can be done remotely when you finally trust your team to handle things without micromanaging every decision." He gestured toward the expanded facility we'd built with his foundation funding. "Besides, this has become more important than stock prices." Through the large windows I'd installed, I could see Sofia in the adaptive playground David had designed, playing with 2 kids whose parents were in our family support group. At 9 years old, she'd become an unofficial junior therapist, with an intuitive understanding of how to connect with people who were struggling. "Lucas wants to study physical therapy," David said quietly. "He's applied to 3 programs that specialize in spinal cord rehabilitation. His grades are good enough, and his personal statement about his recovery journey is apparently very compelling." I wasn't surprised. Over the past few months, I'd watched Lucas discover a calling that went far beyond his original dreams of football stardom. He'd found something more meaningful than individual achievement. The ability to help others find hope in their darkest moments. The sound of laughter drew my attention back to the main therapy area, where Carlos was successfully completing his first independent transfer while Lucas cheered him on. The parallel between their situations had created an instant bond, 2 young men who understood each other's struggles in ways that no textbook could teach. "There's something else," David said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Lucas wants to move back to Denver for college, but he's asked if he can continue working here during summers and breaks. He wants this place to be part of his long-term plans." The idea of Lucas leaving, even temporarily, created an unexpected tightness in my chest. Over the months, he'd become more than just a patient or even a success story. He'd become family in the way that sometimes happens when people survive something difficult together. "What did you tell him?" "That it's his choice to make, but that we'll support whatever he decides." David paused, studying my face. "The question is, are you planning to be here long-term? Because if this is just a temporary phase before you disappear back into the mountains, Lucas should know that before he builds his career around this place." It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself as our small operation grew into something larger and more permanent. The reclusive handyman who'd been hiding from his failures was gone, replaced by someone willing to take risks again, to care deeply enough that loss would hurt. "I'm not going anywhere," I said finally. "This is home now, for all of us." That evening, after the last patient had left and David had returned to his lodge, I found Lucas in the workshop area, putting the finishing touches on a wooden walking frame he'd designed for one of our younger patients. His hands moved with the same precision he'd learned on that first jewelry box, but now that skill served a larger purpose. "Heard you're planning to abandon us for college," I said, settling onto my old stool beside him. Lucas grinned without looking up from his work. "David talks too much. But yeah, I want to study PT. Someone told me once that healing begins with understanding that you're more than your limitations." Sounds like a smart person. He has his moments. Lucas set down his tools and turned to face me fully. Mateo, I need to tell you something. That first day when you made me work on the jewelry box instead of focusing on my legs, I thought you were either crazy or giving up on me. And now? Now I understand that you weren't teaching me woodworking. You were teaching me that I was still capable of creating something beautiful, something useful, something that mattered. You gave me back my confidence before you ever touched my spine. The memory of that first session felt like it belonged to different people. The scared, angry teenager and the broken therapist who'd been too afraid to really try. We'd both traveled so far from where we'd started. You did the hard work, I said. All of it. I just provided the tools. Maybe. But you provided something else too. You showed me that failing at something doesn't make you a failure, and that sometimes the most important healing happens in the parts of yourself you can't see. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the evening sky, the same peaks that had been my refuge for 3 years before becoming the foundation for something larger. Sofia was asleep upstairs, dreaming whatever dreams 9-year-olds dream, secure in the knowledge that her father had finally found his way back to the work that made him whole. In a few hours, David would arrive for another day of watching his son help other families navigate their own impossible journeys. Carlos would continue his recovery, growing stronger while helping others do the same. New patients would call, desperate voices on the phone asking if there might be hope for someone they loved. And I would answer those calls, no longer afraid of failure or success, understanding finally that healing wasn't about achieving perfect outcomes. It was about showing up for each other with courage and compassion, ready to try again no matter how many times we'd fallen short before. The wooden jewelry box Lucas had made that first week sat on my desk, now holding the business cards and contact information of all the families we'd helped. Not perfect, but beautiful in its imperfections. Not a cure, but a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things come from starting over with patience, persistence, and hope. Some stories don't end with miraculous recoveries or fairy tale conclusions. They end with people choosing to keep trying, keep caring, keep building something meaningful together. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.